Our second session is on defining and implementing the most policy-relevant counterfactuals. Our framer for this session is Dr. Laura Peck, and she is a principal scientist at Apt Associates and has 25 years of experience evaluating social welfare and employment policies and programs, both in research and academic settings. A policy analyst by training, Dr. Peck specializes in innovative ways to estimate program impacts in experimental and quasi-experimental evaluations. And she applies this to many social safety net programs. Dr. Peck is the principal investigator, or a co-PI, for several major national evaluations for the U.S. Departments of Health and Human Services, Labor, and Housing and Urban Development. Dr. Peck is the author of Experimental Impact Analysis for Program Improvement, a recent 2020 SAGE publication, co-author of a public policy textbook, and has published more than 40 peer-reviewed journal articles. She also serves as the global lead for APP's Research, Monitoring, and Evaluation Capability Center, for which she advances the latest methods and practices across all of Apt Associates' diverse portfolio of work. Dr. Peck is also the secretary of APPAM's executive committee, and she earned her PhD from the Wagner Graduate School at New York University. After she kind of tees up the session, we're going to hear from Dana Rotz on coping with the varied counterfactuals in systematic reviews. Dr. Rotz is a senior researcher at Mathematica. She has more than a decade of experience evaluating policies and programs for low-income working families and has worked on several systematic review efforts. She currently serves as Deputy Project Director for the What Works Clearinghouse and is the Principal Investigator for the Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse. Her work identifies promising and successful programs, summarizes research about what works, and provides tools to practitioners in using research to make decisions. Dr. Rotz holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University. And then following Dr. Rotz, we'll finish up the session with Steve Bell, and he's going to discuss an experimentally based tool for measuring the full impact of an ENT program compared to a no services counterfactual, absent a no services control group. Steve Bell is head of evaluation research at Westat, and he has spent his career leading research to identify government programs that effectively address social problems, particularly programs in the workforce development area. He has designed numerous randomized impact studies, regularly introducing new tools for learning more from social experiments, often melding experimental causal inference strategies with complementary quasi-experimental techniques. His contributions to impact evaluation design and analysis are widely published. Dr. Bell holds a PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And now I'll turn it over to Laura.
Good morning, everyone. I would like actually to start with a poll. So Samantha, if you want to pull up the first poll, I will ask the audience, all 141 of you, thanks for chiming in today. How often do you use the term counterfactual in conversations? So your options here, as you can see on your screen, are daily, it's indispensable to my work and life, from time to time, rarely, or counter what? Implying never. So once you have had a chance to go ahead and submit that, I'll have Samantha share the results back. And in introducing, I just want to share that my role here is to really frame this session on defining and implementing the most policy relevant counterfactuals. So the opening question is to gauge whether you are familiar with this term. The results here show that half of you use the term from time to time, 19% daily, another 20% rarely, and 9% don't even know what that means, which gives me an opportunity to provide some context on that. So thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and get started with the concept of the program impact in evaluation. And the definition of program impact that I'm going to use stems from the statistical literature on causal effects and is based on the concept of potential outcomes. Potential outcomes for a person are the outcomes that a person would have had under a different set of experiences or conditions. And each person has two, potentially more, potential outcomes, where the treated outcome is the outcome that that person would experience if assigned to or offered access to a program. And the untreated counterfactual outcome, or counterfactual for short, is the outcome that the person would have experienced if not assigned to or not gained access to a program. And the problem is we cannot observe both of these potential outcomes at the same time. And so in the program evaluation world, what we do is come up with proxies for identifying these untreated potential outcomes. And these fall into what I will call reflexive, comparative, and control, these kind of three categories of proxies. And first, we've got the the concept of a reflexive proxy for a counterfactual. A reflexive proxy involves comparing someone's outcomes in both the treated and untreated states as before or after an intervention. And so older Harry Styles compared to younger Harry Styles. We can also use a comparative proxy. A comparative proxy involves comparing someone's treated outcomes to the untreated outcomes of someone else. So older Harry Styles compared to River Phoenix, let's say of the same age, right? My 14-year-old daughter's heartthrob versus me as a 14-year-old, my heartthrob then. But perhaps the best way to capture the untreated outcomes is that of a randomized control group. And we can randomize who gains access to an intervention such that the two groups look alike in all ways except for the presence of the intervention. And so flip the coin, when it turns up heads, those individuals get randomized to a treatment group. Tails puts you in the control group. And that control group's experience is, and their outcomes are what represents the counterfactual. And whether from a reflexive comparison or control group proxy, the impact is computed as the difference between the treated outcomes and the untreated outcomes. And this is what I'll refer to as the outcome contrast. And what I want to focus on further in framing this concept of the counterfactual, particularly as we move into thinking about the concept of policy relevant counterfactuals, is not just the outcome contrast, but the intervention contrast. And what the outcome contrast is about really is it's the evaluation questions that are going to drive what specific counterfactual conditions we might be interested in capturing. So there's APPAM's president, Maria Cancian, and she's asking, what is the outcome contrast related to, or what is the impact of offering access to the program, of participating in the program? What's the impact of one program model compared to another program model? What's the outcome? What's the impact of the standard program compared to an altered version? And these are all alternative ways of thinking about an intervention contrast. That is the treatment conditions relative to the counterfactual conditions. And I want to unpack this concept of the counterfactual conditions and flag to you that I think there are three main types of intervention contrast that are going to be based on these alternative counterfactual conditions. What I'll refer to as no services counterfactuals, business as usual, or alternative treatments. And as Patty shared her introduction, you'll note that in Steve's presentation, he's particularly interested in this concept of no services. Maybe when you don't actually have that as a counterfactual, you're stuck with business as usual and want to kind of back out the no services comparison. But the important point that I want to make here is that the concept of impact, the outcome contrast, has to be interpreted relative to something, and it's interpreted relative to the counterfactual, the intervention contrast. And because of that, it makes it really important to be explicit about what the counterfactual represents. And on my screen, I can still see John Martinez's face. I'm thinking back to some of his comments as well, as I think are relevant here to thinking about kind of what we can document in the field, both in terms of the readiness of an intervention, but then what it's compared to. And so I'm going to take a hypothetical example of each of these three types of counterfactuals: no services, business as usual, and alternative treatment, and kind of a hypothetical example from the workforce development context to try and make somewhat more concrete what these counterfactual conditions might give us as we think about the policy relevance of each. So let me start by sharing with you here the concept of a no services counterfactual, what that represents, right? So the top bar here, let's say that's the counterfactual represented by no services, that is no job training. The bottom bar is the outcome experience of those in the treatment group. So those who are exposed to training. The outcome noted on the left side, let's say that it's employment at some follow-up point. And the top bar there, the no job training, reflects the outcomes that if you got no job training at follow-up, 50% of that group are employed. It's a reason that it's important to have a good proxy of a counterfactual, because we know that things change in the world anyway, right? So just because they got no job training doesn't mean that they have no employment. And then the job training group, let's say that their outcome is at 75%. So the intervention contrast is the difference between no job training and got job training. And it's that intervention contrast that leads to the outcome contrast, here a 25 percentage point increase in employment. So next I'm going to think about the business as usual comparison, where the counterfactual experience is whatever job training is out there. And depending on the community, that could be not so much, or it could be quite a lot. And in this case, the counterfactual outcome indicates that the average employment rates were, let's say, 65%, compared to a specific intervention that we want to test to see whether it improves above and beyond whatever else is out there, sectoral-based job training. And so the difference between whatever else is out there and the sectoral-based job training, that's the intervention contrast that we're evaluating the difference in outcomes that it then generates. And in this case, looks like a 10 percentage point increase. This is the business as usual comparison. So next what I'm going to do, I'm going to move this treatment bar, sectoral-based job training, up so that it no longer is the treatment, but instead represents the counterfactual, right? So what was before our treatment is now the counterfactual condition. This is, that shouldn't say business as usual, the top slide there. It should say alternative treatment. Sorry about that. So this is the alternative treatment image, right? Where we have something that is our standard treatment, in this case, the sectoral job training. And we want to see whether some particular alternative to that intervention improves upon the impact, or perhaps allows us to maintain that impact, but at a lower cost. Here, what we've done is carve out a piece of the intervention that is intensive coaching to add to our standard treatment, sectoral-based job training, to see whether that addition will result in any additional benefits. So this is a situation where the intervention contrast is really just the addition of that intensive coaching piece, and it allows us to identify whether that addition improves upon the standard intervention that we have. And so these are the three kinds of counterfactual proxies, the counterfactual conditions that I want to discuss, the no services, business as usual, and alternative treatment. And it's really going to be the evaluation questions that drive which one of these we use. Each of these is going to have some kind of evaluation design associated with it, whether it's reflexive, comparative, or control. And what we really want to do is figure out what's the evaluation question that's going to determine whether we use a no services counterfactual, business as usual, or alternative treatment. And so this brings me to my next poll question for the audience. So Samantha, if you want to bring that up. My question for you, now that I've defined these three counterfactual conditions options, no services, business as usual, and alternative treatment, which one of these, in your experience, really offers the most policy relevant counterfactual? And while you take a moment to answer that question, I will foreshadow what is coming momentarily, where Dana and Steve will be discussing further applications of these counterfactual concepts. And in the context that Dana's going to be discussing that of systematic evidence reviews, similar to what Anna Lisa was talking about, there's potentially a lot of heterogeneity that is maybe a combination of no services, business as usual, and alternative treatments. Interestingly here, in all of your experience, you have found overwhelmingly that business as usual is the most policy relevant counterfactual. And my guess is that's going to depend somewhat on where you sit, right? Those folks who identified alternative treatment, I'm going to hypothesize that they are program managers figuring out how best to configure their programs for optimal impact. There's a few of you who have voted for no services. So I'll be interested if you have questions or comments that you want to post in the Q&A box. I will be interested to hear your thoughts on why you made that choice, particularly in light of the comments that Dana and Steve will be sharing to come here. I'm including here on my last slide my contact information if you'd like to reach out and be in touch. But in the meantime, I will turn it over to Dana and look forward to her presentation and Steve's and to continuing this conversation about counterfactuals.
Thanks, Laura. I think you did a really nice job of framing this issue that I'm going to now kind of talk about how we tackle in systematic reviews and clearinghouses in terms of the fact that, you know, it really depends what your counterfactual condition is, and that's really crucial. I think that's really crucial for understanding the outcome differences that we see. So can everyone see my slides? Okay, awesome. So I'll just jump in then. My name is Dana Rotz. I'm a senior researcher at Mathematica, and I'm looking forward to talking with you today about how systematic reviews and also clearinghouses cope with varied counterfactuals So the key issue here is essentially that these clearinghouses and systematic reviews are trying to bring together lots of different information on similar or the same intervention. But what you end up dealing with is not only do those intervention implementations differ considerably over space and over time and across, you know, different studies, but also the counterfactual conditions to which those interventions are compared can be very different. So I'm going to start jumping in by talking about some of the key features of systematic reviews and clearinghouses that are particularly relevant when we start thinking about varied counterfactuals. This is going to build off of some of what Anna talked about earlier, but I know we've got some churn in the participants here today, so I'll make sure to cover the basics there as well. I'm then going to turn to the issues related to varied counterfactuals that the systematic reviews and clearinghouses face. and then talk about how they cope, what systematic reviews and clearinghouses do, and how study authors can really help. So let me start with systematic reviews. So systematic reviews kind of fundamentally tend to use systematic methods to find research studies, assess study quality, collect secondary data, and synthesize research findings. They typically synthesize research on different implementations of the same intervention, and they typically synthesize research on the same intervention compared with a variety of different counterfactual conditions. So an example of a key research question that a systematic review might be trying to answer is looking across research studies, is a particular program effective at improving a particular outcome? Research clearinghouses can take a variety of different forms. I'm going to talk mostly about the research clearinghouses that are associated with systematic reviews in terms of this presentation. These include clearinghouses like the What Works Clearinghouse, the Clearinghouse for Labor Evaluation and Research, the Concord and Campbell Collaboration, HOME-V, TPP Evidence Review, Teen Pregnancy Prevention Evidence Review, crimesolutions.gov, evidence-based programs, and on and on and on. There are quite a lot of these types of research clearinghouses. These research clearinghouses typically either indirectly or directly allow users to compare findings across research studies or systematic reviews. They might, for instance, address what intervention should I implement if I want to improve employment outcomes for individuals receiving TANF. Or they might allow a user to see what interventions have been shown to be effective, for instance, for improving reading comprehension among early readers. So framed by Laura's kind of conversation about counterfactuals and these characteristics of systematic reviews and clearinghouses, I'm going to talk about two key issues that these types of projects face in dealing with varied counterfactuals. The first of these is that systematic reviews estimate average effects across multiple intervention implementations. So what do I mean here? Why does this in relation and in combination with varied counterfactuals really matter? Well, suppose you were interested in synthesizing findings on transportation assistance. You wanted to know that, what was the typical effect of adding transportation assistance to a program? And you found 3 studies. Maybe the first study looks at an intervention group that received both vocational training and transportation assistance to help them get to their training, whereas the comparison group receives vocational training without that transportation assistance. In study 2, you have a similar setup where your intervention group is receiving transportation assistance along with job search assistance, and the comparison group is receiving only job search assistance. And then in study 3, perhaps you've got a comparison group that's receiving transitional employment, and in your intervention group, your intervention group is receiving both transitional employment and transportation assistance to help them get to their work sites. So all of these studies really provide valuable information on the effects of transportation assistance, but they all provide it compared to a different counterfactual. And so it's tricky to know that if the average effect of transportation assistance is significant and positive, for example, should an adult education program consider providing transportation assistance? It's not clear because it's an average effect across these multiple implementations and across kind of multiple intervention groups compared to different comparison conditions. Likewise, if an average effect is null, should a transitional employment program consider removing assistance? Well, again, based only on that average effect, it's hard to tell. However, the synthesis still produces useful information. It produces impacts produced by the typical study, estimates of that impact. It produces estimates of the impact compared to business as usual in a lot of senses, where business as usual can take on a variety of different forms, but is in some sense still business as usual. But it's not the only piece of information you should be using to make decisions. And when contextualized, the information produced for decision makers by calculating these kind of average impacts can be especially rich. And by combining those average impacts along with kind of the impacts produced by each of the individual studies and contextualizing each of those individual studies by providing information on both what the intervention group received and what the comparison group received. These systematic reviews and syntheses can really tell people not only what works, but in which contexts. The core issue that we run into here, though, is that the counterfactual isn't always documented or isn't documented in a consistent manner. Another issue that I'd like to highlight that clearinghouses in particular face is that clearinghouses can allow users to compare impacts across interventions. This can be really valuable, but it also can be somewhat dangerous if not approached appropriately. So I'm going to start off by kind of talking about a classic case of comparing interventions, and then I'm going to toss in kind of the added complexity that different comparison groups can bring. So suppose you want to compare intervention A with intervention B, and you know that the annual impact on earnings of intervention A is $1,500. The annual impact of intervention B on earnings is $500. Well, it's really tempting to conclude that intervention A is better in some sense than intervention B. Of course then, and this has really no relationship to the counterfactual, you can start thinking about the cost of the intervention per participant. So perhaps intervention A costs $4,000 to deliver per participant, whereas intervention B only costs $500. In this case, it begins to tip the scales more towards intervention B. It has a smaller effect, but it's a whole heck of a lot cheaper. The comparison group and differences in counterfactual conditions further complicates, this kind of decision making. Because suppose that intervention A was really being compared to a counterfactual in which the comparison group received less intensive services from that same intervention provider. So they're getting something, and in fact, they're getting something from the same provider that's providing the intervention. In contrast, intervention B is being compared in research to a counterfactual condition of services available elsewhere in the community. So the intervention group is receiving intervention B, and the comparison group doesn't get anything from the intervention provider and perhaps has to go out and seek services elsewhere. Then this kind of third dimension is very important to consider in comparing these different interventions, okay? And really needs to be brought into those comparisons. Now, it's not that comparing interventions is not still useful. It's just that users should be able to keep that counterfactual condition in mind when comparing across interventions. It's one piece of information. The impacts are another piece. The costs are another piece. But really, bringing them together is important. The core issue here, however, is that the counterfactual isn't always documented or isn't documented in a consistent manner in research studies. Same issue we ran into when we talked about comparing across multiple implementations of the intervention compared to different comparison groups. So what do we do? What should systematic reviews do? How do they handle these differences? And how can they help users understand the counterfactual? Well, I really think there's kind of four key things that clearinghouses and systematic reviews do and should do in order to cope with these variations in the counterfactual and make sure that decision makers really have the evidence that they need in order to make their decisions, or can find the evidence that they need maybe once they've narrowed their kind of options down using clearinghouses. The first is to document what is being combined. So what individual impacts are being combined into an average impact in order to create that average effect. In addition to kind of those individual point estimates, a description of those point estimates is really valuable. So describing, clearinghouses and systematic reviews can really describe what is being synthesized and how to think about potentially different intervention implementations and contrasts to different counterfactual conditions. The third thing is to clarify what users can and cannot conclude based on syntheses and kind of caveat those average findings. This is the average finding combining effects across multiple studies, it doesn't necessarily apply to your specific condition, your specific situation, but it can inform your specific situation. And then finally, it's very valuable to interrogate the differences across estimates that go in to the same kind of synthesized estimate, both in terms of differences in implementation and differences in terms of the counterfactual, as well as to interrogate kind of differences across interventions and across average impacts. To see what is driving those differences. This can be done in a variety of different ways. Meta-analysis is one common approach, but there are also alternative, more qualitative approaches, or kind of approaches that fall in between, like a qualitative comparative analysis. So the next thing I want to talk about is how three of my favorite clearinghouses handle the counterfactual. But before I dive into that, I do want to frame the discussion here with one kind of key caveat, and that's that the nature of the counterfactual condition is fundamentally different across different topic areas. In particular, when we think about medicine, which really was the genesis for clearinghouses and systematic reviews compared to social policy. But there's also variation kind of, between the different areas that, researchers that examine questions related to social policy, see. So on one side of the spectrum, we really have medicine. And in medicine, placebos, first of all, are often possible. To test a drug, you can give someone else, you can give a control group a sugar pill, and then compare the placebo to the intervention, the new drug. That's feasible. But even when placebos are not possible, most medical interventions are compared to a standard of care. And in medicine, for various reasons, related both to the way medical education is conducted, as well as malpractice insurance, the standard of care is pretty prescribed and doesn't vary too much. You come in and the doctors see that you have pneumonia. You're gonna be prescribed a broad spectrum antibiotic. It might be one of, 3 or 4 different antibiotics, but the chemical composition of those antibiotics is relatively similar, and kind of the thing that you're going to get with the standard of care is pretty similar. Employment and training, I feel like, is on the other side of the spectrum. Employment and training interventions operate typically in a service-rich environment. There's a lot of places people can go to get employment and training services. Sometimes those services can be costly to access, but generally those services are available. So there is a business as usual, but it varies widely. It can vary widely over space, rural areas versus urban areas. It can vary based on who you are. So dislocated workers or veterans are eligible oftentimes for more services than other individuals who they might have a lot of things in common with. So we have a business as usual, but it can take a whole lot of different forms. In between medicine, employment, and training, although arguably closer to employment and training, is K-12 education, which is an interesting case to consider when thinking about counterfactual conditions, because really, there are very few circumstances in the United States where you can compare an intervention to nothing, because everyone gets something. Everyone is eligible for K-12 education publicly provided. It's also the case that business as usual varies. So your K-12 education is really going to be different across different spaces and over time and for different people, but it's somewhat standardized. You know that if you're a kindergartner, first grader, second grader, they're going to be working on phonics with you. Now, how they're working on phonics can be very different, but there's some basic things that we expect will happen, inside education. That's actually interesting because it means that education studies tend to not describe the counterfactual as clearly as employment and training studies on average, but it's something to keep in mind. And then finally, in education, you often see program A compared to program B because it's really difficult if you're evaluating curriculum to really not have another curriculum to contrast that with. If you want to look at a fractions curriculum for fourth graders, there's gonna be something else going on with fourth graders doing math in the classroom. So with all that said, I do want to talk a little bit about three of my favorite clearinghouses. I call them that because I've worked on all of them. It's not like an accident. And I am, there is that bias that is inherent there and that favoritism, but I think there are really good examples here to show kind of what some clearinghouses are doing, and they focus on employment as well as education. So let me first start talking about DOL's Clearinghouse for Labor Evaluation and Research. CLEAR. CLEAR is interesting in that it looks at a broad set of topic areas related to labor and employment. Anna started talking about this, but it includes both employment and training interventions and topic areas related to employment and training interventions, as well as kind of more rules and regulations relevant to the Department of Labor, like OSHA enforcement, as well as some other areas. So each study in CLEAR has a detailed profile explaining its context, including the counterfactual. The comparison condition is described in detail to the extent that it can be, and CLEAR conducts qualitative syntheses to enable, and that enables differences in counterfactuals to be described and considered when synthesizing evidence. Operating in a similar space in part, but with a more limited scope, is OPRE's Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse. This clearinghouse really focuses on research on employment and training programs for low-income workers. So the topics are kind of included in CLEAR, but CLEAR includes a broader set of topics where Pathways focuses on these topics in more detail. So each study in the Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse has a detailed profile explaining its context, including the counterfactual to the extent feasible. And Pathways really takes a kind of interesting approach, I think, to synthesizing findings by interventions when interventions can be compared to different counterfactuals. And that's in the way that Pathways defines an intervention. So a study that looks at a certain intervention compared to a business as usual counterfactual, and a study that looks at the same intervention but compared to another intervention would be typically considered to examine different interventions. Also, Pathways is going to be looking at syntheses across all studies included in the Pathways Clearinghouse, as well as syntheses by type of intervention. Interventions rated supported or well supported receive an implementation profile, which can contain details on the counterfactual condition, and Pathways allows individuals to compare across interventions. Thirdly, we've got the What Works Clearinghouse that synthesizes evidence on education from early childhood through post-secondary education. Each study has a detailed profile explaining its context, including the counterfactual to the extent to which information is available. There are really two products that the What Works Clearinghouse produces, and that's intervention reports and practice guides, synthesis products. There's a variety of additional products that the WWC does create to help teachers and educators and researchers. But intervention reports tend to summarize research on the same intervention. They include interventions contrasted with different counterfactuals, but that variation in the counterfactual condition is documented to the extent feasible. Practice guides are different. They summarize research with the goal of recommending practices, and interventions and counterfactuals in those for practice guides can really be holistically examined by an expert panel based on the What Works Clearinghouse's practice guide approach. And the What Works Clearinghouse also allows users to compare across interventions. So why am I telling you all this? You're mostly an audience of researchers that that might work on clearinghouses and syntheses, but might really not. So I think there's kind of a couple asks here. Clearinghouses and syntheses are oftentimes the way that decision makers, kind of at the local level, at the state level, practitioners are accessing research. So there's four things I think that kind of study authors can really do to help systematic reviews be able to take into account of the counterfactual. And I've kind of ordered these from great to amazing. If you're doing one or two of these, that's awesome. If you're doing all four of these, then, I'll take you out to dinner sometime. But in any case, the things are from kind of what could be the easiest to what might be the most difficult are documenting the counterfactual, both the intended services and the actual services and the unknowns. It's really useful to know what we don't know. The second thing is please present both intent to treat and treatment on treatment effects, if those are available. Oftentimes clearinghouses prefer reporting on ITT effects. Sometimes that's not the case though. And these really are comparing your intervention to different counterfactuals. And so both are very valuable. The third thing is to consider the counterfactual when choosing to present pooled or site-specific impacts. We know that people often pool because you don't have power when you don't pool. But if you're really comparing the same intervention compared to vastly different counterfactuals, think about that and think about whether site-specific impacts might be more valuable to present or presenting both. And then finally, consider the counterfactuals implemented by past research in designing new studies. Think about how those counterfactuals should influence the counterfactual that you look at in your study and kind of how to take that, how users of your study, how readers of your study should take those differences into account. Finally, I'll just conclude with the moral of the story. Systematic reviews can be very useful, but their usefulness really depends on the description of the intervention, the counterfactual, and their variation, and to make those descriptions easy for users to handle and accessible to users, and as rich as possible, authors really need to provide the details on the intervention group, the comparison group, and variation therein. Thank you very much. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve, who is going to be talking about a specific instance of how you can get one counterfactual from another, or how you can get maybe two counterfactuals is a better way to put it from a single study.
Good morning, everyone. This is about working on the thing that most of you said is not the important counterfactual in your experience, no services. And so partly I want to try to persuade folks to think about that being important, but in that context, provide a way to achieve impact measures where the estimate is really the full effect of a workforce development intervention against no such intervention, even though your experiment can't itself include a no services control group. I do have a quiz question, which I'll ask Samantha to put forward, because in an experiment, the counterfactual happens in the control group. So think about this circumstance in a control group of your study and how you would feel about it. Here we are. Very worried. Half of you all would be very worried if 40% of the control group were discovered to be doing a program similar to the treatment that's the focus for the evaluation. You're echoing or mirroring on the control side what the treatment group is doing in 40% of that control sample, or at least something quite similar to it. And just 10% would be unconcerned. The larger context here, as most of you probably know, the evidence has been mentioned. The evidence from employment training program evaluations, rigorous studies, is that there's very little that's been found to be effective on any kind of an important scale in terms of economic improvement for participants. We think there are multiple reasons for that, likely. Programs may get evaluated prematurely if we don't follow John's protocol. And an immature intervention is not going to effectively increase employment earnings. Study samples may be too small to detect something that is working as statistically significant. And we're measuring against business as usual, by and large, as I think our experiences shows from Laura's poll question and is reflective of the information out of the clearinghouses. And that means that we have to beat, our program has to beat other things in Laura's bar graphs. Let's look at that last one. This business as usual, everything else that's out there, is that what we should have as the standard for deciding? An intervention isn't one society should undertake if it's not going to, at the margin, outperform a bunch of other things society is already undertaking. This incremental contribution concept is what's often used for funding decisions. And scholars like Bell and Peck have said, hey, if everything else that's out there is enough, which would mean you'd get a zero impact against the business as usual counterfactual, money spent could be cut back without consequence. Bell at least has rethought that, not retracted, but thought beyond that a different counterfactual is needed to do something different for policymakers. To let us all understand, are these employment training programs helpful overall compared to their complete absence? How big is that total effect? So there you'd want to compare outcomes with a particular employment training program to outcomes without any, and you'd want to do that comparison without selection bias. Here's where I'm going to take this. First, we have to accept that there's not going to be a randomized design that will get at this. The no services control group won't happen in our world. But there's a subpopulation of the control group in most employment training evaluations that doesn't get any similar services to the focal intervention. So my strategy, my recommendation is to focus there, calculate experimental bounds on impacts in that subgroup, and then move from there to a non-experimental but experimentally validated way to get impacts on the rest of the population. I realize that quick outline it's not going to be something you can quite grasp. So that's what the rest of the talk is. We're in a multi-layered federalist system of social assistance provider at state, local, and federal levels, and each of those levels has many ways of trying to help people do better in the workforce. There's no target population that gets unserved that you'd go out now and try and experiment with, and you could do a treatment group and have an unserved control group. Nor can you impose exclusion from all employment-related assistance just for the sake of your research. That's unethical, would presumably make people worse off in the control group. So we're stuck with having to go somewhat into non-experimental designs if we want to learn how big is the contribution of any of our employment and training strategies against not doing that sort of thing at all. We have to find workers, and this could be a very fraught non-experimental situation, because if you think about it, we're looking for a comparison group of similar workers who don't select into the focal program, and already we know about motivation and other things that make that a skewed group. And furthermore, don't select into anything else that's being offered that's a similar employment training assistance, even more skewed. So let's use what a randomized experiment gives us. And that is, as I've said, a subset of the controls who naturally receive no employment and training services. And as an example, and this was long ago, but it was at the time, the National JTPA study, 73% of those who were randomized out of JTPA got nothing. Now, we can't just say, oh, great, we've got a nice counterfactual there to measure the effect of impacts of the whole of JTPA against no employment training services. Because this is a selected 73%, and probably in most studies, it's not that big a share. But we can use that subset of the control group as a counterfactual for the corresponding subset of the treatment group. And that gets us started as toward impacts of the focal intervention against no assistance. And the tool for grabbing hold of a subpopulation like this, which is endogenous, they're determined, getting or not getting services in the control group is determined after randomization. It's not an observable thing on the treatment side. The tool for getting at this is analysis of symmetrically predicted endogenous subgroups, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, shortened to ASPIS. ASPIS uses baseline characteristics of sample members in a randomized experiment to predict membership in endogenous subgroups. From Laura's work going way back, but this is a good place to read about it here in 2013. So you do symmetrically sort the treatment and control groups into the likely cases who will be unserved if assigned to the control group. Calculate impacts on those predicted subgroups. And since they're predicted on the X's, this is like calculating impacts on the subset of women or the subset of high school dropouts. It's, it's experimentally valid estimates for a predicted set of likely folks to have not been served if assigned control. To get a finding on the subpopulation that was truly unserved when assigned to control, you have to make assumptions. And in my latest work, I discovered that the assumptions that one might make really are the basis for creating bounds, upper and lower, of impact. So you can eliminate the assumptions if you're willing to live with findings that are, here's the lowest the effect might be on this endogenous subgroup, here's the highest it might be. So there's a version of ASPIS, bounded ASPIS, that does not make assumptions beyond the source experiment. So it has full internal validity for these boundaries. It addresses the policy question of interest, the impact of the focal program compared to a no service counterfactual. But it doesn't cover the whole population that matters. This is only for those who will, if assigned control, get no services. So we've got internal validity, but to get external validity, that is a finding on the whole population served by the focal intervention. We've got to somehow get an effect on those in this subpopulation who, if assigned to control, do get other types of employment training services. And there, the experiment can't be exploited because that subpopulation is getting employment training services either way, if assigned to control or presumably if assigned to treatment. So we have to turn to non-experimental methods to create a counterfactual for those folks. There are lots of things one might do in that regard. In fact, the first challenge is to figure out who are those folks in the treatment group, the ones whose impacts we have not yet estimated, the ones who would have been unserved who would have been served if assigned to the control group. And my notion is to get there by elimination, by first trying to figure out who would have been unserved in the treatment group had they been assigned to control. That's what ASPIS has predicted along the way in the analysis I've already described. Now that prediction is not 100% accurate, so adjustment of moving cases in and out of the probable treatment sample from this subpopulation that would have been unserved if assigned to control. Some adjustment could be made. At which point, all the other treatment cases are in this subpopulation of served if assigned to the control group. And there's where we have to apply non-experimental impact estimation techniques. One of those techniques that I'll illustrate, and as I say, there would be a lot of candidates. One of them is to do a dosage analysis. So for those treatment cases that we couldn't get an impact estimate on it experimentally through ASPIS, do a dosage model of how outcomes go up or down according to a continuous indicator of the extent of the focal treatments delivered. Maybe number of days spent in the program, big D. And controlling for characteristics of individuals, predict the key outcome Y as a function of days in the program and individual characteristics. And then project for every individual down to a dosage amount of 0. And I've called that Y superscript 0. That's the predicted outcome if you're untreated. That's the counterfactual, for each individual. It's only accurate if this fitted model of how dosage relates to outcomes is correct. But it does give us a projection of a counterfactual of no service. Then average those predicted outcomes, the actual outcomes, Y bar, the counterfactual outcomes with dosage set to 0, Y super 0 bar, take the difference between them as the impact measure. For those folks who, if they'd been assigned control, would have received some services. This whole approach can be tested for the other half of the sample where we already have some experimental evidence. Those who have assigned to control would not have received ENT services. And the way we've specified the dosage model can be tweaked to assure it's giving findings consistent with the ASPIS-based experimental evidence in the population where we had that evidence, the subpopulation where we had that evidence. In fact, that notion can be carried through to completely different ways of not doing non-experimental estimates for the subpopulation of folks who, if assigned to control, would have received some services. Whatever you decide to do for that group, do it as well for the group who, if assigned to control, would have not received services, and make sure you're getting alignment to the experimentally driven ASPIS bounds. This is in the spirit of the within study comparison literature for trying to find non-experimental approaches that replicate experimental evidence. And at that point, you've got something you trust somewhat more, where you're forced into the non-experimental world. Combine the two pieces, and you've got lower and upper bounds of impact for the full population on the question of how does this focal intervention, employment training intervention improve things over a world with no employment training services. which was the starting point of all this. Samantha, can you queue up the last poll question for me as I wrap this up? The issue of trying to go from an experiment with a control story that's business as usual to a different thing, to learning about something different, is established in literature as important. For example, in research on Head Start's effectiveness, where the National Head Start Impact Study had a control group that children got care in a lot of settings. And a bunch of research has now come out trying to, from that experiment, find a way to tell policymakers, is Head Start making a difference compared to no center-based care? To being home with parents. When the original study with the business as usual counterfactual, a straight up interpretation of experimental findings was not answering that. We had the opportunity to do analogous empirical work on employment and training programs. The ideas here provide one roadmap for that. There's vast material to work from. There's so many extant random assignment employment and training experiments where, if there's a decision made to invest in this kind of learning, choices can be made wisely as to which of those existing studies are the best platforms for moving on this agenda. And finally, you could even design future experiments to be better at supporting our ability to answer key policymaker questions of the sort, do ENT programs help overall compared to no ENT, and how big are the total effects of the ENT programs? Did we do the other poll? It's the same question, right? I just wondered if anybody had got a new point of view on it. Both from the standpoint that, the wording, both from the standpoint that I've argued that no services in the control group might be really important, more important than you were thinking, but I've also, I hope, supplied some reason to believe it can be worked around. So concern about a 40% involvement may be less severe. And I think somewhat anxious is a proper point of view at this moment. These are new ideas. So happy to have had a chance to share them with you and interested to get your reactions.
So it looks like we have a couple of questions for Dana to start with from Gary Bond. Is the first one. You make the great point that counterfactual conditions, control groups, are poorly defined in research reports. My question is about the degree to which the intervention of interest is well defined, specifically through a validated fidelity scale. Do you have any statistics from one of your clearinghouses mentioned this morning, or from a specific topic in one of the clearinghouses, on percentage of studies with well-defined interventions, i.e. through fidelity measurement?
So, short answer to that question is I do not know of any clearinghouse that tracks that and has, statistics on that I could share. There may be some clearinghouses may, just not the ones I think that I know most intimately. I would say that the kind of availability of that information is really going to depend on your field. So there are differences across fields in the extent to which the intervention is kind of well-defined, or it's just kind of, we're going to provide additional support for this, and we're going to look at the services that people get in a survey. So what I'm thinking of here is I'm thinking of, considering something like home visiting versus employment and training intervention. So home visiting, in that space, there are a lot of kind of branded interventions that operate where there actually are, set criteria for implementing the intervention and implementation fidelity checklists. I'm not sure if clearinghouses tend to catalog those, but that's kind of a different type of approach than employment and training, which we do have, some interventions that are very well defined and have those implementation checklists. Since given the asker of the question, I'll mention IPS as a kind of example of that. But for the most part, those types of kind of well-defined branded interventions are not common in the employment and training space. So I think that's the one reason why we don't see clearinghouses tracking that. Would I love to see that as a possibility, in particular for certain areas where these types of fidelity measures exist? Certainly, but I don't see it as something that would be coming soon in the employment and training space, simply because most of the interventions in that space kind of don't comply to that type of model.
Great, thank you. Another one for you, Dana, from Rob Olson. Could you elaborate on the recommendation to consider counterfactuals implemented by past research when designing new studies? In what way should the counterfactuals from previous studies influence the design of new studies?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rob. I really appreciate it, because I was running a little long in my presentation from where I was at in my dry run, and actually cut off some of the things I wanted to say there. So thanks for the opportunity to return to that. I think there's a few things that should be kept in mind here. I think the first thing is, to think about how your research will likely be combined with other research. And just kind of to think about how many different dimensions what you're testing is really varying on compared with past research. So suppose that you were really interested, you had a program that was, shown to be effective or had some evidence of being effective, and you wanted to try a similar strategy, but with a different population. Suppose that program was implemented with, dislocated workers, and you wanted to try it with low-skill workers. So that's kind of one dimension that things are varying on, is the population. And I think it's important to think crucially about whether you should also vary another dimension there, such as the counterfactual, or whether you should be careful to make sure that your counterfactual condition is similar to that from the original study. So you're not changing two things, but you're just changing one thing. So that's just one example of what I was thinking there. There are certainly others, but I think it's really crucial to keep in mind that that people take your study and run with it. And some of that is done formally, some of that is done informally, but really to think about the context in which people will view your study, I think is really important.
Great, thank you. I see Laura has put in a set of resources, a link to them in the chat box, so people keep an eye out on that. We have two questions for Steve. There's one that was actually in the chat box that I'll mention. So for Steve, would it be possible to use this strategy by back testing with data held from previous studies?
Yes, that's exactly what I meant when I said there's a lot of material to which we can turn to try to pull out findings on the question of effects of employment training services against a world without.
Well, and it's a great opportunity, certainly, to ask lots of new evaluation questions, right, to exploit existing data. And it's the approach that Steve described is great, not just for the TOT question, the no services counterfactual question, but a variety of mediational questions as well.
Great, thank you. Let's see, Steve, one more for you. How granularly do you need to capture dosage for this approach to work? And how do you explain to program staff to operationalize that level of capture?
Actually, that ties to the first question, because that would be the thing that one, where there's the greatest uncertainty as to whether past, evaluation databases would have what it takes, is a sufficiently granular and meaningfully captured dosage indicator. And I'm thinking of drawing John into this right now. It's not in the data system. It didn't happen. How granularly? It depends on the duration of the full intervention. A participant who goes the entirety of some program that's designed to be 9 months, I would think it would certainly be sufficient if you had something weekly, a number of weeks participating before dropping out. If it's an intervention that's only going to be 2 months long, I don't know. I think you might have to have how many days, or maybe that's not enough variation to actually expect it would have much to do with outcomes, and the whole idea wouldn't work. And you'd need to look for a different non-experimental scheme to get at that second group where the ASPIS tool didn't already take care of your needs.
And if I can answer that question from some of my recent experience too, I have looked at whether there's any take-up versus completion of one or two components of an intervention versus completion of the full intervention, right? So you can think about it, Steve's talking about it in sort of a continuous way, which is helpful, number of weeks or days out of a full semester or whatever the intervention time is. But you can also think of it relative to any take-up versus completed all of the elements of what's out there.
Yeah, I think you need to have, you need more than three, three platforms, three plateau points to get a coefficient on how much difference it makes to outcomes that you could comfortably extrapolate back down to you didn't do any of them as your zero for the counterfactual. But yeah, you can work off of milestones that aren't part of a continuous scale if there are enough of them.
Mm-hmm. And it'll just be determined by the research question of interest.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, that is all the Q&A we had for this session, and that's actually all the time we had for this session. So that's perfect right now.